The Maastricht Treaty is one of the biggest steps in the making of what we now call the European Union. It set up the EU proper and laid the groundwork for a shared money system, what would end up as the euro. What it did first was make the European Union real, proper, official. Taking over from the old European Economic Community, it brought in what they called a three-pillar setup. The first bit was the European Communities, all about pulling together on trade and money matters. Part of that was the monetary union. It set out rules for countries to follow if they wanted to use the same coin, the euro. That's also when they made the European Central Bank to run the show on that front. The second pillar was all about common foreign and security policy, getting countries to speak as one on world matters and defence. The third dealt with justice and home affairs, things like law, borders, and keeping the peace inside the countries. Another big thing was EU citizenship. So folks got the right to live, work, and even vote in local elections in any EU country, not just their own. It also pushed for stronger political pulling together, so the European Parliament got more say. There was more teamwork on foreign matters, defence stuff, and keeping law and order across the whole lot. This treaty is seen by many as the birth of today's federal-style EU, a bit like how the USA is set up. A lot of folks in Britain started calling it the United States of Europe, and not always in a good way. The Anti-Federalist League, or AFL for short, was a small group made up of folk from different parties starting in Britain back in 1991. It came together to stand against the Maastricht Treaty, which they saw as a step too far toward giving away British sovereignty. The name Anti-Federalist League was picked on purpose, a nod to the old anti-federalists in 18th century America, who were dead set against a big central government. The founder of the league was Sked, with Helen Szamuely as co-founder. Sked said he set up the AFL, in his own words, to mobilise public opinion in defence of British sovereignty and to prevent the UK becoming a province of a united European superstate. Some big names were part of the league early on, like Nigel Farage, who later went on to lead UKIP. He, like a fair few of the others in the AFL, had come from the Conservative Party before jumping ship out of strong Eurosceptic feelings. The AFL believed folk weren't being given a proper say on something as big as this, a key matter for the country's own future. So they ran AFL candidates in elections to try and fill that gap, to give the public a voice where there weren't one before. Alan Sked's a British historian and political thinker, known for standing firm on national sovereignty, democratic say-so, and a kind of principled liberalism. He weren't against the European Union because of nationalism or fear of foreigners, but because he saw it as undemocratic and out of reach from the people. In his view, it weakened the power of Parliament here in Britain, taking away control from those we actually vote for. As someone who studied European history deep and wide, Sked reckoned the EU looked too much like the top-down empires of the past, full of red tape and bosses folk didn't choose.
By about the late 1980s, I was beginning to think it didn't add up. I just met too many silly bureaucrats, too many corrupt politicians, too many had-been theorists, and I thought, no, this is a waste of money. We're not gaining anything out of it. It's profligate, it's corrupt, it's undemocratic, it's bureaucratic. The last straw came when a very fat man from the European Commission came over, a spherical creature I'd ever seen. He was head of transport, and he had maps of all these countries of Europe. This is Ireland. The Irish want to build roads on the west coast. We say, no, we must build roads on the east coast. All roads must lead to Brussels. We did this for about 7 or 8 countries. I just thought this was mad. Then I decided, Thatcher was fine when she was president and we got on well, but when Major became Prime Minister, I decided that a think tank was no longer the way to put pressure on the government, that we needed another party. And so, because I'd already got a certain notoriety in the Bruges Group, I was able to set up a new party called the Anti-Federalist League.
He had no time for xenophobia or the far-right talk that later cropped up in the same movement he helped set going. His Euroscepticism came from what he saw as sound constitutional and democratic beliefs, not from crowd-pleasing or stirring up anger. Though some tie him to the political right because of his views on Europe, Sked's always said he sees himself as a centrist or a classical liberal. He's backed civil freedoms, fair social policies, and level-headed debate all the way through. However, he is seen as too left-wing by the current Eurosceptic movements post-Brexit, so these ideals are also why you don't see much of him anymore. Helen Szamuely was born in Moscow to a Russian mother, Nina Orlova, and a Hungarian father, Tibor Szamuely, both of them academics. When she was just 3, the family moved to Hungary. Her parents later got caught up in the fight against communism, taking part in the 1956 Hungarian uprising. She grew up in an Anglophile home, and had seen the true face of communism and socialism close up, and none of it good. She called herself a classical liberal, not a libertarian, because while she backed the nation-state, she believed its power should be kept in check. She was a major voice in the early days of Britain's anti-EU movement. She co-founded the Bruges Group and believed strongly in British sovereignty and proper democratic control.
In the circumstances, the only check, the only control over a government would be a referendum. Now, clearly, we cannot call a referendum over every bit of issue, but when it's a serious constitutional issue and Parliament that proclaims itself sovereign but is not, it is the people who are sovereign. We merely hand Parliament power temporarily. It should not have power to give the sovereignty of this country away. At that point, the people, the sovereign people, must have a right to control.
To her, the EU was a threat, not just to the country's independence, but to folks' freedom as individuals. She brought brains and principle to the fight, always pushing for clear rules, open politics, and a say for the people. All through her life, she stayed firm in wanting Britain out from under the EU's thumb, mixing sharp-minded argument with a fire-in-the-belly drive. She also held the House of Lords in high regard, and saw herself as proud to the core, a patriot through and through. The Bruges Group, which she helped set up, came about in 1989 as a pushback to growing EU control, especially after Margaret Thatcher's big Bruges speech in 1988. In that speech, Thatcher warned against turning Europe into one big superstate, instead calling for a group of free nations, working together but not ruled over. The Bruges Group was made to back that idea. It brought together thinkers, writers, MPs and campaigners who wanted to keep Europe as a partnership, not a power tower in Brussels. They stood for British self-rule, free trade, and the right for every country to make its own way. Over the years, the group became a hub for Eurosceptic thought. Helen first got stuck into anti-EU work in 1991, when she met Alan Sked for tea in Oxford. Not long after, Sked asked if she wanted to join the AFL's committee. Helen later said she was a bit surprised, but reckoned Sked wanted to steer clear of the AFL, looking like some all-male, middle-class club full of stuffy little Englanders. She stated, "I was female, of Hungarian origin and had a doctorate, so that ticked a few boxes." In the early days of the AFL, she even got a hesitant Nigel Farage to start handing out leaflets. But while she had sharp thinking and strong belief, she weren't always cut out for public life. One ally said she could be impatient with the less gifted. There were 5 women standing as candidates at the time, which were seen as fairly forward-thinking back then. Among them were some well-known names worth mentioning. Dr. Helen Szamuely stood out, who we have already been over. Then there were Angela Ellis-Jones and Anne Bullock, both trained in the law as barristers, and both had past ties to the Conservative Party. Susan Nelson were also in the mix, a sculptor from Oxford who'd made a name for herself speaking up for the environment. Last but not least, there were Valerie Fohn, a journalist from Pendle, known for her work in local papers. They believe the Maastricht Treaty significantly reduced British sovereignty, especially in areas of law, economics, and foreign policy. The party was strongly against the UK joining the proposed European single currency, the euro. They warned this would undermine national control over economic and monetary policy. The AFL believed the EU lacked democratic accountability. They viewed the European Commission and other bodies as remote, technocratic, and unrepresentative of ordinary citizens. The AFL argued that key powers, especially over lawmaking and borders, were being handed over to unelected EU institutions. They believed that British Parliament and courts should remain the highest authority, effectively making the UK a puppet state of a wider EU federal community. Rather than political union, they wanted a return to a looser trade-based relationship, like the original European Economic Community, the EEC. They were not anti-European, but opposed to European federalism. Rather than a European Union, the AFL wanted a loose association of all European states, retaining their independence to trade equally with European and other partners. The AFL called for a national referendum on continued EU membership, a demand that would gain more traction in later years. They stated in an AFL leaflet that the people of Britain should not be forced to give up their independence, their parliament, and their democratic traditions. Since they are not consulted and are not to be allowed to vote on the matter, they are in effect being forced. At the heart of the AFL's manifesto were a clear and firm stand against the Maastricht Treaty. They called for Britain to pull out straight away from the exchange rate mechanism. On top of that, they wanted a full rework of both the Common Agricultural Policy and the Common Fisheries Policy. A core belief of theirs were that British law had to stay above any rule or order coming out of the European Union. Instead of going down the road of tighter political union, the party stood for a loose binding of free and self-ruled European nations. Most of all, they promised to stand firm for British parliamentary rule, which they reckoned were coming under growing threat from Brussels. The AFL didn't think any of the main parties could be trusted to look after British say-so. The Conservatives in particular were seen as tied up tight with the Maastricht Treaty. That's why the AFL believed it were vital to be the one party openly pushing for full breakaway from the EU. They weren't about narrow thinking either. The aim were to build a broad tent, pulling in folk from the right, the left and the middle. Their leading belief was simple. Independence came first. All them deeper arguments could wait till after. Looking forward, they saw the 1994 European Parliament elections as the next big showdown. They reckoned Europe would take up more and more of the political spotlight. and the press wouldn't be able to brush their message aside for much longer. If them elections were to be held under a fairer vote system, like proportional representation, then every single vote would matter proper. Winning seats weren't seen as likely, not right away anyhow. The real goal was to wake the public up to the Maastricht Treaty and give them a clear stand-up choice away from the usual pro-Maastricht parties. Therefore, the AFL was set up with just one main aim: to stand against the Maastricht Treaty and stop the UK being drawn further into the European Union. While the party did talk about bigger worries like keeping our say over our own laws and protecting democracy, it didn't really offer much of a plan when it came to everyday home matters, like many single-issue parties. It grew out of folks' discontent with the Conservative Party, especially when John Major were in charge. The AFL stood for old-style conservative ideas, looking after our own borders, backing British ways, and not trusting foreign rule from Brussels. It talked in a way that felt down to earth and against the top brass, taking aim at the ruling sorts in both Westminster and the EU. For many, the AFL acted as a way to show protest, giving a voice to voters who reckoned none of the main parties were listening when it came to Europe. Winning elections weren't the main goal, it were more about sounding the alarm, pushing the big parties to take notice, and turning the talk of the nation. At its heart, the party put great stock in Parliament, pushing for keeping our lawmaking in our own hands, and sticking to the British way of rule. This tied in with a kind of civic nationalism, not about race, but about keeping our institutions strong and making sure we govern ourselves. The League stood 17 candidates in the 1992 general election, but failed to make any impact or attract any press attention. It lost all its deposits. The following year, Helen Sked represented it in by-elections in Newbury, gaining 1% of the vote, and Christchurch, where he got 1.6%. The AFL tried to attract disaffected Conservative Party members, particularly those put off by John Major's pro-European stance. It became a meeting point for Maastricht Rebels and other grassroots Eurosceptics. Though not given much mainstream airtime, Helen Sked and other AFL members appeared in debates and interviews, framing EU integration as a constitutional crisis. Their rhetoric influenced later political discourse around sovereignty and democracy. A lot of the AFL's early backing came from disillusioned Conservatives who felt let down by John Major's push for the Maastricht Treaty. These were mostly older folk, patriotic, and deeply concerned about the loss of British sovereignty. Many had supported Margaret Thatcher. Her Eurosceptic stance struck a chord with what the AFL was saying. There was also strong support from voters whose Conservative MPs had stood firm against Maastricht in Parliament, the so-called Maastricht Rebels. For them, the AFL gave voice to a cause they felt was being ignored by the main parties. It drew from both classical liberal and conservative traditions, valuing national independence and parliamentary sovereignty. Then there were the sovereignty-first nationalists, people who believed Britain should govern itself fully, without any interference from Brussels. They saw EU membership not just as economic cooperation, but as political overreach. Though the AFL never managed to match UKIP's later reach, it did find support in parts of the country that had been left behind. These were often declining industrial or rural areas where people felt alienated by globalisation and stifled by EU regulation. Trust in Westminster was already low in these places, and trust in Brussels was even lower. The AFL was also shaped by a small circle of academic and intellectual Eurosceptics, and some of its early supporters were scholars who opposed European integration on constitutional or legal grounds. They were few in number, but their influence helped sharpen the movement's arguments and messaging. Still, through the early 1990s, the AFL's support base remained small and politically niche. Inside John Major's own Conservative Party, a faction began pushing back hard against the Maastricht Treaty, seeing it as a direct threat to British national sovereignty. By May 1992, around 22 Conservative MPs rebelled during the second reading of the European Communities Amendment Bill, a number that outstripped Major's fragile majority of just 18. During key Maastricht Treaty votes, several Conservative MPs had the party whip withdrawn, including prominent rebels such as Theresa Gorman, Richard Shepherd, and Nicholas Budgeon. Other influential figures in the group, like Bill Cash, John Redwood, and Ian Duncan Smith, remained within the party fold, but were nonetheless vocal in their opposition. They made full use of parliamentary tactics to stall the process, including the infamous stretcher vote, where one MP, seriously ill, was wheeled through the voting lobby on a hospital gurney to cast his vote against the government. The rebels were openly backed by prominent Eurosceptics such as Margaret Thatcher and Norman Tebbit, adding serious weight to the rebellion. In response, John Major tried to bring them into line by first threatening a snap election, then putting forward a confidence motion to force their hand. At one point, the Conservatives' polling figures plunged as low as 23%, and the 1993 Christchurch by-election delivered a heavy blow, flipping a majority of over 23,000 into a 16,000 vote defeat. The government only just scraped through key votes, sometimes relying on the Speaker's casting vote or tying confidence votes to hold the line. These rebellions left a lasting mark, deepening the party's internal divide over Europe and leading to future rule changes aimed at reining in backbench dissent. The Anti-Federalist League kicked off as a grassroots movement. No money behind it, no backing from the press, and no well-known names lending their weight. Right from the get-go, they came up against strong pushback from both the papers and the wider political setup. The AFL often locked horns with the media, saying that the big outlets were cutting them out on purpose. One moment that stood out were with Channel 4's dispatches. The AFL said they chopped out an interview with their leader, Dr. Helen Sked, while giving pro-European voices plenty of time on screen. They went further, saying that some journalists were working hand in glove with the main parties to keep talk of the Maastricht Treaty out of the public's ear. As a reply to all this, the AFL warned they might take their case to the Broadcasting Standards Commission, saying they'd been shut out of fair say in the country's democratic talk. As if things weren't hard enough, the Maastricht Treaty itself were near impossible for folk in Britain to get hold of. In a strange turn, HMSO, the government's own printing office, had withdrawn it from sale over a fight between ministers about how to write an acronym. Meanwhile, Denmark were going about things in a very different way. Over there, they printed 300,000 copies of the treaty for the public, which helped stir up a proper debate ahead of their vote. With the British government keeping quiet, the AFL decided to take charge of it themselves. They printed the full text of the Maastricht Treaty on their own and sold it for £1.95, making sure everyday folk could finally get a look at the paper that were redrawing Europe. They even paid for stamps to spread the word and shine a light on how little the public were being told. Only 3 countries in the European Union held referendums on the Maastricht Treaty: Ireland, France, and Denmark. Ireland, where a public vote was required due to constitutional changes, held its referendum in June 1992, approving the treaty with a clear 68.7% majority. France followed in September 1992, holding its own referendum and passing the treaty by a razor-thin margin. Just 51.05% voted in favour, in what became known as the Petit Oui, or Little Yes. Denmark initially rejected the treaty in a June 1992 referendum, with 50.7% voting against it. But this result wasn't accepted, and Danes were told to vote again until they eventually returned a yes. The rest of the EU, including the UK, ratified the treaty through parliamentary votes alone, transferring sovereignty to a new supranational union without seeking direct public consent. The treaty continued its difficult passage through Parliament, taking nearly 2 years before it was eventually ratified in August 1993. Amidst extraordinary scenes in the House of Commons, and in the teeth of fierce opposition from the Maastricht Rebels, the Maastricht Treaty finally passed into UK law. For Britain, the most heated part of the treaty was the social chapter and the joining of a new European currency. But for many, the treaty itself was a step too far, seen as yet another surrender of national sovereignty to Brussels. Although it was deeply unpopular in public opinion polls, it still passed with backing from all 3 main parties in Parliament. John Major did win some concessions in the end.
He had negotiated away the word federal from the treaty and got Britain an opt-out from the social chapter and single currency.
But only under intense pressure from the Maastricht Rebels within his own party. After the treaty came into force, many within the Anti-Federalist League came to believe that simply blocking integration was no longer enough. With the EU firmly in place, they argued the only true course left was full British withdrawal from the EU altogether. The case for Remain and Reform was lost. In late 1993, Sked and others came together to form a new political party, the UK Independence Party. When the treaty was ratified in the UK, Helen Sked wrote to Prime Minister John Major, laying out UKIP's criticisms of the treaty and its ratification. Not all League members followed Sked into the new organisation, but the party quickly replaced the League, which soon faded from view. The Anti-Federalist League helped legitimise Euroscepticism as a serious political position, not just a fringe protest movement. It shifted the debate over the European Union away from dry economics and toward deeper questions of sovereignty and national control. Phrases like unelected Brussels bureaucrats and loss of national control entered wider political use through the AFL's messaging. These themes went on to shape Eurosceptic rhetoric, and still do to this day. Its very existence sent a warning to Conservative leadership under John Major and those who followed, that division over Europe wasn't just a party problem, it had real electoral consequences. Alt helped shift Euroscepticism from the political fringe into the centre of national debate. It gave legitimacy to criticisms of the European Union grounded in sovereignty, democracy, and national self-determination. It helped build the pressure that fractured the Conservative Party and later reshaped British politics, stopping the UK from ever fully becoming a federal EU member state. The AFL formally transformed into the UK Independence Party in 1993. While it didn't directly cause Brexit, the AFL was part of the chain reaction. AFL to UKIP, to public pressure, to a referendum, to Brexit. Today, the Anti-Federalist League is mainly remembered as the forerunner of the UK Independence Party, and through that, its later successor, the Brexit Party, now known as Reform UK. These arguments would go on to shape future political movements in the UK, and laid the groundwork for a lasting public divide over Europe. Though small in number, the AFL was an early warning sign that the main parties were drifting away from a segment of the electorate on Europe. And in doing so, it proved that even small, committed groups, if they stay the course, can leave a mark on history far bigger than their size.
For it is the doom of men that they forget.